Hey everybody, I'm excited because we are continuing our series on Ruth, and we are in Ruth chapter 2. And you know what's interesting is stories matter. And as I was thinking about how I tell my kids stories before they go to bed, and when at a certain age I stop doing that, they miss that. And that's because stories play such a huge role in our life, and the story of Ruth is actually no different. And what's interesting is that with Ruth, much like all the other books in the Bible, there's not just one story, but there's a story within the story. And so Ruth is not just about bringing redemption to a broken family, but bringing redemption to broken humanity. Ruth is a story about a family that's going through suffering and how God is working, not in spite of the suffering, but through the suffering, but not just to redeem them, but to redeem the entire world. And it's interesting how you can see God's cosmic renewal plan of salvation working itself out in everyday normal life here in the book of Ruth. And so let me ask you a question as we begin, which is this. Have you ever had one of those as it turns out moments, right? You know what I mean? Like you applied for a job and as it turns out, that job changed your life. Or maybe you met someone at a dinner party that you weren't going to go to, but as it turns out, you ended up marrying the person. Some of those stories are very interesting to us. We love them, mostly in hindsight. But when you're in it, it feels meaningless, it feels ordinary, maybe random, maybe routine. And that's what we find in Ruth chapter 2. A woman going to work, just a woman stepping onto a field to pick up leftovers, nothing special, nothing miraculous, but God is up to something. And I just think that when we dive into Ruth chapter 2, what we want to make sure that we are asking ourselves is this: what if what God wants to do is not necessarily through all of the miracles and signs and wonders that can definitely happen and that can definitely be a part, but through your normal everyday life of waking up and going to work and getting kids ready and studying for finals and all of that? What if God is wanting to do something so special there? We're going to read Ruth chapter 2, but before that, let me just kind of catch you up, because in Ruth chapter 1, what happens is that there's this person named Naomi. She is living in the land of Moab, and she has a husband and she has sons, and they are married, and she loses her husband. There's a big famine. She loses her sons, and she is left with her two daughter-in-laws. She pleads with them to just go ahead and go live your life, and she's going to live hers. And Ruth, who is one of Naomi's daughter-in-laws, says, no, I'm going to stay with you. And wherever you go, I'm going to go. Your God will be my God. And they end up going from Moab back to Bethlehem. And the end of Ruth chapter 1 lets us know that when they got to Bethlehem, it was the beginning of the harvest season. And that's very important for this story. I thought about, we're going to read the whole chapter, all of Ruth 2. And I was like, what a great way to have this chapter read than by someone in our very young congregation whose name is Ruth and whose parents are going to read Ruth chapter 2 for us. So would you welcome Pat and Haltrice as they read Ruth chapter 2.
Hey Inspire, this morning we're going to be reading from Ruth chapter 2. Ruth asked Naomi if she could head out and try to find work, maybe gather some leftover grain in a field where someone might show her a little kindness. Naomi agreed, and Ruth went out, not knowing where she'd end up. It just so happened that the field she stepped into belonged to Boaz, a successful, respected man who was part of Naomi's extended family. Ruth started picking up whatever grain was left behind, quietly working behind the harvest crew.
Later that day, Boaz showed up to check on things. He noticed someone new, asked about her, and was told she was a woman from Moab, the one who came back with Naomi. She'd been working since morning, barely stopping to rest. Boaz walked over to her. He didn't just notice her, he saw her. And without making a big deal about it, he made sure she was safe. He told her she was welcome to stay in his field, work alongside his crew, and drink from their water supply anytime she needed.
Ruth was caught off guard by his kindness. She wasn't from around there. She didn't expect anyone to go out of their way for her. but Boaz already knew her story. The loss, the loyalty, the courage it took to leave everything familiar and start over with Naomi. He respected it and he honored it. At lunch, he invited her to eat with the team. She sat down and he made sure she had more than enough. Afterward, he quietly told his workers to make space for her, leave extra grain on purpose. Let her gather right up close, don't make it awkward, just let her be.
Ruth worked straight through the day. By evening, she had nearly a full sack of grain. She carried it all back home, along with the leftovers from lunch, and showed Naomi. Naomi couldn't believe it. "Where did you go? Who was this generous to you?" When Ruth told her it was Boaz, everything shifted. Naomi lit up. He wasn't just kind, he was family. One of the few people who could actually help change their situation. It felt like maybe, just maybe, God hadn't forgotten them after all.
Ruth explained that Boaz had invited her to stay through the whole harvest season, and Naomi encouraged her to do just that. It was safe, it was wise, it was good. And so she did. Ruth stayed at Boaz's fields all through the barley harvest and into the wheat harvest too.
Thank you, Pat and Haltrice. As we get into this book, specifically this chapter, there are some things that I'd like to highlight. In fact, I'm going to do what Pastor Phil did previously, and I'm going to break up this chapter into scenes. And so there's 5 scenes that we're going to go through for this message. And scene number 1 is this. It's just a field, right? Listen to this, verse 2. It says this. One day Ruth said to Naomi, "Perhaps I can go out into the fields and some kind man to glean the free grain that are left behind from the reapers." Now, at this point in the story, you have to remember Ruth is a foreigner. She is a widow. She's not thinking about family trees. She's thinking about survival. And widows had rights in the society that she found herself in. And that's primarily because of a law for gleaning that we find in Leviticus chapter 19. It says this: "When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap the very edges of your field or gather the gleans of your harvest. Do not go over your vineyard a second time or pick up grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner, for I am the Lord your God." So Ruth tells Naomi, she says, "Listen, let me go out and let me pick up this leftover grain." Translation, what she's saying is, let me do what I can do. Let me do what I can with what I've got. Now let me pause for a second, because if there's anybody that feels like they are in that season, they're just trying to do what they can with what they've got, well, then you are in the exact moment of the story that Ruth is in. And Ruth isn't trying to be strategic, she's trying to be faithful. She's not looking for Boaz, she's looking for barley. And so when the narrator says this in verse 3, "So she did this, and as it happened, the field where she found herself belonged to Boaz, the relative of Naomi's husband." That phrase, "as it happened," it's the writer's doing something very intentional there. It's not just a casual coincidence, right? But it's a subtle wink. It's saying, and as it happened, wink, right? It's letting you know, actually, God is behind all of this. God's fingerprints are all over this moment. And maybe you've had those moments, right? Where you thought you were just picking a college, or you thought you were just moving to a random apartment, or you thought you were just signing up to help. And as it happens, it wasn't random at all. We see that phrase, "as it happens," actually a unique phrase. We do see it throughout Scripture, but not very often. For instance, back in Genesis 24, Abraham's servant prays to find a wife for Isaac, and it's a pivotal moment in Israel's history. And that is the moment that moves God's promise forward. And when the prayer is answered, it says something very similar. It says that exact phrase. It says, "as it happened," or "as it happened to happen." It's a rare Hebrew phrase. And what the writer of Ruth is trying to let you know is that this moment, this field moment, matters so much. In other words, to make the point very clear, what feels accidental to us is often strategic to God. What feels accidental to us is often strategic to God. See, Ruth is just doing what she knows to do, but God is weaving into her story a redemptive line, you see? It reminds me of Lord of the Rings when Frodo and Sam are having a conversation and they're talking and they say, "I wonder what sort of tale we've fallen into." The same could be true of your life, right? The relationship that didn't work out, the job you didn't get, the risk you took and you weren't sure if it was going to lead anywhere. It reminds me of the movie Pursuit of Happiness. It's based on a true story of Chris Gardner, who was played by Will Smith, and he's a struggling single father in 1980s in San Francisco. And after investing in a failing business, Chris finds himself homeless, caring for his young son, trying to land an unpaid internship in a competitive stock brokerage firm, all while sleeping in shelters and subway bathrooms. And every day in the movie, he wakes up and the odds are stacked against him, but all he tries to do is what he knows to do. He just tries to do the right thing, and his persistence ends up paying out. And not just his persistence, but coupled with a few moments of unexpected kindness and God's, it just happened to happen moments. And those things ended up changing his life. What if God is in the just so happens of life? What if God is in the just so happens of your story? Because some of the biggest work starts in the background. See, Ruth wasn't chasing destiny, she was chasing survival. She had no map, no master plan. She walked through a field that looked like any other field. But that field, it wasn't just soil and stalks, it was sacred ground that God had been working, because God was already there, writing redemption into the ordinary. Because in the kingdom of God, nothing just happens. See, in the economy of heaven, there are no accidents, only appointments. There's no coincidences, only divine choreography. God is not a passive observer. He is a sovereign orchestrator, the grand architect, the eternal author who writes purpose into every pause, meaning into every mess, redemption into every detour. When it looks like chaos, he is composing a symphony. When it feels like science, he is speaking in sequence. So don't fear the unknown, but trust the one who is already in your tomorrow. Because in his kingdom, in his dominion, in his unshakable sovereignty, nothing just happens. Not for you and not for Ruth. See, one of the ways that he starts turning the page of Ruth's story is through a man that doesn't just glance at her, but sees her. This is scene number 2. Who you see says everything. So Ruth shows up in a field and she's there to work, and that's it. She's a widow, she's poor, she's from Moab, which, if you know Israel's history, is a strike in itself, right? And she's gleaning, essentially picking up the leftovers from the edge of the field, hoping to collect enough to feed her and Naomi. And now enters Boaz, this third character. He's a landowner. He's the guy that's in charge. He's the one with all the social power in the story. He arrives, but when he arrives, he doesn't just say hi to everybody, but he actually greets everybody and he blesses everybody. And then he notices Ruth right away. Look at this, verse 3, it says this, and so she did, in other words, and so she went out to the field, and as it happened, the field where she found herself belonged to Boaz, the relative of Naomi's husband. Boaz arrived from the city while she was there. After exchanging greetings with the reapers, he said to his foreman, "Who is that girl over there?" Now let's pause for a minute, because this is a turning point. See, now we have all 3 characters in this scene. We have Boaz, we have Ruth, and we have Naomi. And going forward for the rest of this sermon, and in fact the rest of our series, it's going to be very important, because remember, Ruth isn't just a story, it's 2 stories. There's a story within a story, and each of these main characters represents something greater. They are a symbol, they are a foreshadow, they are a type that portrays a greater reality. This is what I mean. Naomi represents Israel, right? God's chosen covenant people. Ruth represents the church, the body and the bride of Christ. And Boaz represents Christ, the Redeemer, the one who paid it all for us. And so what's interesting is the first thing Boaz notices about her in this text is that she's a Moabite. See, Moabites are historical hostiles, rivals to Israel. In fact, in the book of Judges, the preceding book of Ruth, lets us know that Moab is one of Israel's primary oppressors. But Boaz sees more than that. He sees her story. He sees her sacrifice, her loyalty. He sees her dignity before he sees her difference. And so he walks forward. He initiates. He approaches her and has a conversation. And he tells her, listen, don't go to any other field. Stay here. You'll be safe. He tells his guys, don't lay a hand on her. And he tells her, when you're thirsty, drink from our jars. Now remember, this is a male-dominated honor-shame society. And a Moabite woman like Ruth, she is invisible at best and vulnerable at worst. But Boaz doesn't ignore her. He includes her. He sees her. He elevates her with his words, his actions, and his influence. And Ruth, well, Ruth is stunned. She falls to the ground and she says, why are you being so kind to me? And Boaz says something that shows you exactly the kind of person he is. He says, I've heard your story. I know what you've done for Naomi. I know what it cost you to stay. And he says, may the Lord repay you. May you be richly rewarded by God of Israel, under whose wings that you've come to take refuge. And that's not just a prayer, but that's a preview. Because Boaz, whether he realizes it or not, is about to become the answer to his own prayer. So here's the question for you and I. Who do you see? Not just casually, not just when it's convenient, right? But who are you intentionally noticing? Who are you walking towards? Because this moment in the story isn't just about Boaz and Ruth. It's about what happens when people allow the gospel to shape us, to shape how we see. See, the gospel transforms your heart. And when it does that, it changes your posture. It changes who you talk to. It changes who you invite in. In other words, it changes how you view everyone else. And you begin to see that everybody is your neighbor. But see, you can't love your neighbor if you never look their way. And when Jesus Christ was asked, well, who is our neighbor? He basically says everybody. Everybody. And that's what Boaz does. He looks her way. And in doing so, he becomes a part of a redemption story that is still changing lives today. Boaz doesn't just protect Ruth, he dignifies her. He treats her like she belongs in a place that she never thought she would. And part of Ruth is not just being seen, but actually she's feeling seen when she realizes what Boaz does next, which is this. He invites her to lunch. But of course, it's not just lunch. It's lunch with leftovers, because nothing just happens. Scene number 3, lunch with leftovers. Oops, sorry. So Ruth keeps showing up, working, gleaning, doing what she can with what she has. And then comes this sort of small, ordinary moment, but we don't want to miss it. It's lunchtime. Lunchtime. And Boaz, the landowner, the boss, the guy with the status, right, turns to this outsider, this immigrant, this widow that's in the back of the field, and he says this, look at this, verse 14. At lunchtime, Boaz called her, come and eat with us. Now, that's easy to overlook, but that sentence, the invitation, what this is this is the picture of the gospel. Boaz didn't just tolerate Ruth. He welcomes her. He makes room for her. He shares a meal with her. And the text says that she ate all she wanted, and then she had some left over. Now that phrase left over, for those of you who maybe have been a part of church for quite some time now, that might sound familiar. Because centuries later, in Matthew chapter 14, Jesus breaks bread on a hillside and feeds over 5,000 people with a little boy's lunch. And how does Matthew describe that moment? Well, he says this, they all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 baskets full of broken pieces that were left over. Then in Matthew 15, same miracle, different crowd, right? But this time there were 7 baskets full that were left over. 7 and 12. 12 that represents Israel, 7 that represents the number of completeness. In other words, Jesus was making a statement. He was saying, listen, I'm not just here for insiders, I'm here for the whole world. And Boaz is doing the same thing. Ruth wasn't an insider. She didn't grow up in the covenant. She was a Moabite. And yet she was invited to the table. Listen, this isn't just kindness. This is kingdom. See, we live in a cultural moment obsessed with visibility. Our late modern Western world has discipled us into a story where everything is curated, everything is optimized, everyone is told to become their own brand, hustle to be seen. You strive to be significant, right? To reach your influence. But in the kingdom of God, see, it's the outsider who's noticed. It's the foreigner who's fed. It's the forgotten who are invited to the table. Boaz doesn't do what Western culture tells us to, which is to calculate what some can do for us before we invite them in. We don't ask for Ruth's credentials, her status, her background. He didn't do any of that. But he sees her and he fulfills her. He honors her sacrifice and he extends grace, not out of obligation, but out of who he was becoming. See, Western culture forms us into consumers, always causing us to ask, well, what am I going to get out of it? And what do I deserve? But kingdom culture forms us into stewards, people who ask, who needs to be seen? Who can I serve? See, in a society where everything is built on scarcity and competition, Boaz models abundance and invitation. In a system that rewards power, he chooses presence. And maybe that's a prophetic call for the church today, to resist the algorithmic impulse to overlook the Ruths of our city, the marginalized, the vulnerable, the seemingly unimportant, and instead live a kind of life that reminds us and reminds them of Eden, of the Garden of Eden. A life that says there's room at the table, there's grace to spare, and yes, there's leftovers. Because kingdom people aren't defined by what we take. We're marked by what we leave behind. And not only does she eat until she's full, but she walks away with leftovers. That's not a coincidence. That's a callback, right? The writer of Ruth and Matthew, by the way, are pointing back to something much older than even Bethlehem itself. They're pointing back to the Garden of Eden. Because Eden was a place of abundance, a place where no one had to scrape by, where provision was baked into the very soil. And Ruth chapter 2 is a glimpse of Eden again. What started with a famine is now feeding a foreigner. It's not just about getting what you need. It's about God reestablishing the kind of world that he intended from the beginning. And Boaz? Well, Boaz didn't stop there. He doesn't just give her leftovers, but look what he says. He says this in verse 15. And when she went back to work again, Boaz told his young men to let her glean right among the sheaves without stopping her, and to snap off some of the heads of barley and drop them on purpose for her to glean and not to make any remarks. In other words, just drop off handfuls of this stuff for her to be able to pick up. In other words, don't make her scrape by. He doesn't just obey the law, but he goes beyond it. He bends the structure in her favor. And if you are a follower of Jesus, here's what it means. We don't measure generosity by what we're required to do. We measure it by what love leads us to do. In other words, when you lead with grace, you leave more behind than you take with you. And that's what Boaz does. That's what Jesus does. That's what you and I are invited to do. Not to keep people fed, but to point them back to the kind of world God has always wanted. A world where everyone gets invited to the table, where there's always enough. See, it wasn't just a shared meal. It wasn't just a lunch break with some bread and roasted grain and a little kindness in the middle of a long day. He wasn't just being generous, but he was breaking the cycle of self-interest. He rewrites the rules of power. Boaz isn't just feeding Ruth, he's embodying the restoration of all things. And God is always doing more than we think, even in something as small as lunch in a field. Why? Because nothing just happens. And while Ruth is eating, Naomi is about to experience her own shift. Scene number 4. The shift you didn't see coming. See, Ruth comes to this field, and she's carrying way more than anyone expected. And she's coming home, and with not just a few scraps, right? Not just a small bag, but around 20 to 30 pounds. Now that's not normal. And Naomi sees this, and immediately something changes, right? Verse 19, it says this, "So much?" Naomi exclaimed. "Where in the world did you glean today?" Now remember, this is the same Naomi who a chapter ago says, "Listen, call me bitter." The same Naomi who told everyone that God had brought her back empty. But now something has shifted. But not just because she sees the grain, but it's because she hears a name. This is where the shift happens. Watch. For it says this, when she asked, "Well, where did you glean today?" Naomi says, "The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz." And this is where everything begins to hit. And Naomi begins to proclaim, wow, bless him, because he's continued to show kindness to the living and the dead. This is the first time since returning from Bethlehem that Naomi has blessed anyone, let alone bless God. And what's more is she recognizes the significance of the name, because she says, listen, that's just not any person. She says, that person, he is one of our guardian redeemers, one of our kinsman redeemers. In other words, he's one of our relative redeemers. That term redeemer doesn't mean much today for us, but in ancient Israel, it was massive. A redeemer wasn't just a generous relative, right? He was someone with both the right and the responsibility to buy back what was lost, whether it was land, inheritance, even people. And so when Naomi hears Boaz, what she hears is hope, right? And here's what's fascinating. Boaz has already shown Ruth kindness. He's already gone out of his way to protect her, to feed her, to make space for her. And Ruth did not know who he was. And Naomi did not know what he had done. They were both missing half of the picture. It wasn't until the grain and the name came together that the light turned on. And maybe for some of us, that's also true in our stories. Maybe God has already been moving in your story. Maybe he's already made provision. Maybe he's already aligned something. He's already sent someone. But we haven't seen it yet because your story is still unfolding. What seems like a setback might actually be a setup. See, Ruth just saw a field, but God saw a future. Sometimes God is working long before we start noticing. And that's what happened to Naomi. Naomi thought she was forgotten. She thought her story was over. She thought she came back empty. But God had already written redemption in her background. He just hadn't revealed it yet to her. And in one conversation with one bag of grain and one name, the story unfolds to the final scene. Scene number 5, when rescue shows up with a name. So again, Ruth comes home. She's carrying all this grain. And Naomi says, where did you get this? And she says, Boaz. And look at this, verse 20. That man is one of our guardian redeemers. Now, that word in Hebrew is goel. And it carries a lot of weight because it doesn't just describe what Boaz can do, but it reflects who God is. See, let me explain. In ancient Israel, Goel was a legal role, a family member who could step in and restore what was lost. If your family's land had been sold due to poverty, the Goel could buy it back. If someone in your family had to sell themselves into servitude, well, the Goel could go and redeem them. If a man died without a child, leaving a widow vulnerable, the Goel could marry her and continue the family line and restore her. This wasn't charity. This was costly, personal restoration. And it wasn't required. It's not like the Goel had to do it, but it was seen as a sacred act, which is a living picture of God's heart. In other words, this term, Goel, Redeemer, didn't start with Boaz. It started with God. In fact, way back in Exodus chapter 6, when the Israelites were enslaved to Egypt, God said this. He says, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. I will set you free, and I will, Goel, redeem you with an outstretched arm. Same word, same concept. God wasn't just showing up with power. He was stepping in with love. And what God is saying is God saying, I am your Goel. I am your Redeemer. And so when Naomi says Boaz is one of our Goels, she's not just talking about legal technicality. What she's saying is she's saying maybe God is doing something for us like he did for our ancestors. Maybe he's redeeming again. And Boaz, well, he doesn't even realize it yet, but he is stepping onto the story of God that God has been telling all along. And that's because Boaz doesn't just give Ruth food. He gives her safety, a future, a new identity. He takes on her burden as though it was her own. And here's why this matters. Because you don't have to be stuck in Egypt. You see? All of us need redemption. We all need a Goel. We all need a Redeemer. You see? And this is where the gospel meets you. Jesus comes in and he is the better Boaz. He is the true Goel. He is the Redeemer who doesn't just restore your circumstances, but reclaims your story. He pays the cost. He carries the burden.